Burbank, California, 1972. The lights inside the NBC studio burned hotter than they looked on television. From the audience, everything seemed effortless. The polished wooden desk, the microphones, the orchestra waiting beneath the stage lights, the rows of smiling faces, and behind it all, the machinery of late-night television moving with military precision. A stagehand hurried across the floor with a clipboard pressed against his chest. A camera operator checked his focus. Someone whispered into a headset. A producer stood near the curtain, watching the clock. 5 minutes. 4 minutes. 3. Tonight was supposed to be another ordinary night on The Tonight Show *. But nobody backstage knew that one careless joke was about to change the atmosphere inside that studio. Johnny Carson sat behind his desk, calm and confident. For years, he had mastered the art of making millions of people laugh without appearing to work very hard at it. He could deliver a joke with almost no expression. A raised eyebrow, a pause, a tiny smile, and the audience would explode. That night was no different. The crowd laughed. Carson leaned back in his chair. Ed McMahon waited nearby, ready for the next cue. And somewhere behind the curtain stood the night's most anticipated guest. Elvis Presley. By 1972, Elvis was no longer the nervous young man who had first shocked America with his movements. He had become something much larger. A symbol, a legend, a man whose name could fill an arena before he even stepped onto the stage. But fame had changed something inside him. Everywhere he went, people had an opinion about him. Some loved the jumpsuits. Some hated them. Some loved his voice. Others insisted his best days were behind him. Some remembered the rebellious kid from the 1950s. Others saw only the superstar of the new decade. Elvis had learned to live with criticism. But there was one thing he still couldn't completely ignore: being laughed at for something he had given his life to. And that night, backstage, he was about to hear exactly that. Elvis stood in a private dressing area, wearing dark clothing and waiting for his cue. A guitar rested nearby. It wasn't covered in diamonds. It wasn't surrounded by bodyguards. It wasn't some elaborate stage prop. It was simply a guitar. The kind of instrument that had been with him long before the stadiums, long before the screaming fans, long before the expensive cars and flashing cameras. He looked at it for a moment. Then someone opened the door. 5 minutes, Elvis. Elvis nodded. Thank you. The door closed. He was alone again. For a few seconds, there was nothing but the distant sound of Carson's voice. Elvis could hear the audience laughing through the walls. He smiled faintly. Then Carson said something. Elvis couldn't make out the first few words. Another laugh came from the studio. Then another. Elvis looked toward the door. A stagehand passing outside stopped. The voice from the television monitor became clearer. Carson was talking about Elvis. The audience laughed again. Elvis listened. Then his expression changed. The joke wasn't simply about his clothes. It wasn't about his fame. It wasn't even about his image. It was about his guitar. About the idea that Elvis carrying a guitar in 1972 was like an old photograph that didn't belong in the present. The audience loved it. Carson smiled. The band played a tiny musical sting. Everyone moved on. Everyone except Elvis. He sat quietly. For several seconds, he didn't say anything. A young assistant who had been standing near the door, glanced at him. Elvis. No response. Elvis, you okay? Elvis slowly looked up. What did he say? The assistant hesitated. You heard it. Elvis smiled. It wasn't an angry smile. That was what made it unsettling. Yeah, he said quietly. I heard it. He stood. The assistant watched him carefully. Elvis, you don't have to worry about it. Elvis walked toward the guitar. His fingers rested on the neck. He didn't pick it up yet. Instead, he stared at it. That guitar represented something that very few people in the studio understood. It represented the beginning. Before the screaming crowds. Before Las Vegas. Before television executives decided what Elvis should look like. Before anyone called him the king. There had been a young man with a guitar. A young man who didn't know whether anyone would listen. A young man who had walked into a recording studio with almost nothing but a voice and a dream. And now somebody was laughing at the instrument that had helped him begin. The assistant stepped closer. Your entrance is in about 2 minutes. Elvis nodded. I know. You're still going out. Elvis looked at him. Oh, I'm going out. Then he picked up the guitar. A quick question for you. If you were standing backstage and heard a famous comedian make a joke about you in front of millions of people, what would you do? A. Ignore it. B. Confront him. C. Prove him wrong. D. Walk away. Write your answer in the comments and tell us where you're watching from asterisk. And if you enjoy dramatic Elvis stories like this, don't forget to asterisk like the video and subscribe asterisk asterisk. Because what happened next was something nobody inside that studio expected. The stage manager suddenly appeared. Elvis, we're ready. Elvis nodded. He adjusted the guitar strap. Then he looked toward the curtain. The applause from the studio audience grew louder. Johnny Carson had just finished another joke. The band was playing. The cameras were moving. Everything was perfectly controlled. Until Elvis stepped through the curtain carrying a guitar. The stage manager froze. One camera operator looked at another. The producer's eyes widened. Even Ed McMahon seemed surprised. That wasn't the entrance they had rehearsed. Carson looked up. For half a second, he didn't understand what he was seeing. Then he smiled. Well, Carson said, leaning toward the microphone, I didn't know we were having a concert tonight. The audience laughed. Elvis didn't laugh. He simply walked toward the center microphone. His boots struck the studio floor. Snap! The guitar hung against his chest. Carson watched him approach. Elvis, he said, what happened to our interview? Elvis stopped. I heard you were talking about my guitar. The audience laughed again. Carson raised his eyebrows. I talk about a lot of things. I know. The audience became quieter. Carson leaned back. Well, I hope you didn't take anything personally. Elvis looked at him. Then, surprisingly, he smiled. No. Carson relaxed. But Elvis wasn't finished. I just thought maybe you should hear what it sounds like. The room went silent. Carson stared at him. Then he glanced toward the audience. Are you threatening me with music? The crowd erupted. Even Elvis laughed this time. But there was something underneath the laughter. Something Carson recognized. Elvis wasn't there to fight. He wasn't there to embarrass him. He was there to remind everyone of something. Elvis adjusted the microphone. The studio lights reflected across the polished surface of the guitar. He placed his fingers on the strings, and then he played the first chord. It was simple, almost painfully simple. No giant orchestra, no flashing lights, no dancers, no screaming fans, just Elvis Presley and a guitar. The audience stopped laughing. Carson's expression changed. Elvis played another chord, then another, and when he finally began to sing, the entire room seemed to shrink around his voice. For the first time that night, Carson didn't have a joke. He simply watched. The young assistant backstage watched from behind the curtain. The producer stopped moving. The musicians looked toward the stage. Nobody had expected this, because they had expected Elvis, the superstar. They had expected the larger-than-life performer. But what stood before them was something older, something simpler. The musician, the man before the legend. And Carson suddenly realized something uncomfortable. The joke had been easy. The music wasn't. The joke had taken 5 seconds. The voice in front of him had taken 20 years to build. Elvis finished the first passage. He looked toward Carson. Carson didn't speak. Elvis continued playing. The audience leaned forward. A woman in the front row had tears in her eyes. A man near the back whispered something to his wife. The cameras stayed locked on Elvis. And somewhere behind the curtain, the producer whispered, "Don't cut away." Nobody wanted them to. Because whatever this moment was becoming, it was real. Not the rehearsed kind of real television created. The kind that happened when somebody stopped performing for the cameras and simply became himself. Elvis finished the final chord. The note faded into the studio. Silence. 1 second. 2. 3. Then the audience exploded. Applause thundered through the studio. Elvis lowered his head. Carson looked down at his desk. For once, the comedian had no punchline ready. He looked back up at Elvis. And this time, the smile on Carson's face was different. It wasn't the smile of a host setting up another joke. It was the smile of a man who had just realized he might owe another man something. Carson slowly stood from behind his desk. The applause continued. He looked at Elvis, then at the audience, then back at Elvis. And finally, he reached for his microphone. "Elvis." The room began to quiet. Carson paused. Then he said the words nobody expected to hear on live television. "I think I owe you an apology." The audience fell completely silent. Elvis stood there with the guitar still in his hands. And for the first time that night, Johnny Carson wasn't joking. Johnny Carson was still standing behind his desk. The audience was applauding, but the atmosphere inside the studio had changed completely. Only a few minutes earlier, everyone had been laughing. Now thousands of eyes were fixed on Elvis Presley. Elvis stood beneath the studio lights with a guitar hanging from his shoulder. He didn't look angry. That somehow made the moment even more powerful. Carson slowly reached for the microphone. "Elvis." Elvis looked toward him. "I owe you an apology." A few people in the audience murmured. Elvis raised an eyebrow. "For what?" Carson gave a small smile. "For making that joke about the guitar." Elvis looked down at the instrument, then back at Carson. "You don't have to apologize." Carson seemed surprised. "I don't." "No." Elvis paused. "But you should hear why I brought it." Carson leaned forward. I'm listening. Elvis stepped closer to the microphone. When I heard that joke backstage, I didn't think about what you said. Carson frowned. Then what did you think about? Elvis looked at the guitar. I thought about when nobody knew who I was. The studio became quiet. Even the audience seemed to understand that the mood had changed. Elvis continued. Before the big stages, before the television cameras, before people started telling me what Elvis Presley was supposed to look like. He placed his hand gently over the guitar. There was just this. Carson looked at it. The guitar. Elvis nodded. The guitar. For a moment, nobody laughed. Carson leaned back in his chair. So you really carried this thing through all those years? Elvis smiled. Not this exact one. The audience laughed softly. Carson smiled. Good, because I was starting to feel guilty. Elvis laughed. Then Carson asked, why does the guitar still matter to you? Elvis thought for a moment. Because it doesn't care who you became. Carson's smile disappeared. Elvis continued. You can become famous, you can become rich, you can perform in front of thousands of people. He looked down at the guitar. But when you pick this up, he paused. You're still the same person. That sentence hit Carson harder than any joke could have. The host looked at Elvis. You mean the young Elvis? Elvis nodded. The young Elvis. Audience poll. Let me ask you something. If you had something from the beginning of your journey that reminded you where you started, would you keep it? Yes or no? Write your answer in the comments and tell us where you're watching from asterisk. And if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to asterisk like the video and subscribe asterisk. There is still much more coming. Carson picked up a pencil and tapped it against his desk. You know, Elvis, people think they know everything about you. Elvis smiled. They don't. What do they get wrong? Elvis looked toward the audience. They think fame makes you fearless. Carson nodded. Doesn't it? No. Elvis shook his head. Fame just gives your fear a bigger audience. The studio became silent. Carson slowly lowered the pencil. That, he said, is something I understand. Elvis smiled. Everybody does. Carson looked toward the audience. We just don't admit it. The crowd applauded. Then Carson suddenly changed his tone. So let me ask you something else. Elvis waited. Are you still nervous before you perform? Elvis smiled. Always. The audience laughed. You. Elvis nodded. Every time. Carson shook his head. You don't look nervous. That doesn't mean I am not. Carson smiled. So what do you do? Elvis answered simply. You walk out. Carson stared at him. That's it. That's it. What if you're scared? You walk out anyway. The audience applauded. Elvis looked toward the camera. That's what you learn. What? Courage isn't being comfortable. He paused. It's doing it anyway. Carson nodded. For several seconds, the host didn't speak. Then he smiled. You know, Elvis. Yes. You're making my show sound like a philosophy class. The audience laughed. Elvis grinned. Sorry. No. Carson shook his head. I like it. Then Carson pointed at the guitar. But I still want to know something. What? Can you actually play that thing as well as everybody says? Elvis looked at him. A mischievous smile appeared on his face. You want me to prove it? Carson immediately leaned backward. Well, the audience began laughing. Elvis stood. Carson pointed toward the guitar. I should be careful what I ask for. Elvis walked toward the center of the stage. The studio lights followed him. The band members looked at each other. Nobody had been expecting another performance. The producer backstage looked nervous. He whispered into his headset. Are we still live? Yes. Keep the cameras on him. Elvis sat down. He adjusted the guitar. The room became quiet. No introduction. No announcement. No dramatic build-up. Elvis simply started playing. The first notes were gentle, almost private. Carson stopped moving. The audience stopped laughing. For a moment, the entire studio felt like a small room somewhere decades earlier. Elvis closed his eyes. His fingers moved across the strings. The sound was imperfect. And that was exactly what made it powerful. There was no giant production behind him. No dancers. No bright stage effects. Just the instrument and his voice. Carson watched closely. The same man who had been joking minutes earlier now looked genuinely fascinated. When Elvis finished, he let the final note fade. Silence. Then the audience erupted. Carson stood and applauded. Elvis smiled. Carson walked toward him. You know what? What? I think I understand the guitar now. Elvis smiled. What changed your mind? Carson pointed toward the audience. They stopped laughing. Elvis laughed. Carson continued. And started listening. Elvis nodded. That's all I ever wanted. Another quick poll. Be honest. Did Elvis handle Carson's joke the right way? Yes, he answered with music. No, Carson shouldn't have made the joke. Comment yes or no and tell us your city and country. And if this story has you hooked, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Carson returned to his desk. But something had changed between the two men. The joke was gone. Now there was respect. Carson looked at Elvis. Can I ask you one serious question? Elvis nodded. Go ahead. Do you ever get tired of being Elvis Presley? The question hit differently. Elvis looked down at the guitar. The studio waited. Finally, he answered. Sometimes. Carson didn't expect that. Sometimes. Elvis nodded. People think being famous means you can do whatever you want. He looked toward the audience. But sometimes it means everybody else decides what you should be. Carson listened. They decide what you should wear. Elvis continued. What you should sing. What you should say. What you should look like. And if you change. He paused. They say you've lost yourself. Carson asked. So how do you stay yourself? Elvis looked at the guitar. Remember where you came from. Carson nodded. And this guitar does that. Elvis smiled. Every time. Carson leaned back. Then I guess I owe that guitar an apology too. The audience laughed. Elvis looked at him. You better. Carson laughed. All right, I'm officially apologizing to the guitar. He stood and bowed dramatically toward it. The audience erupted. Elvis laughed so hard that he had to lower his head. For the first time that night, both men were completely relaxed. Then Carson looked toward Elvis. You know what the funny thing is? What? I made one little joke backstage. Elvis waited, and somehow you turned it into the best segment of the night. Elvis smiled. Maybe you should make more jokes. Carson laughed. Absolutely not. The audience roared. The show was nearing its end. The band began playing the closing music. Elvis started walking toward the curtain. Then Carson called out, "Elvis!" He turned. Carson stood behind the desk. "One last thing." "What?" "If I ever make another joke about your guitar." Elvis waited. Carson smiled. "Don't bring it back." The audience laughed. Elvis slowly smiled. "Why?" Carson pointed toward himself. "Because I don't think I can survive another lesson." The studio exploded with laughter. Elvis shook his head. "Good night, Johnny." "Good night, Elvis." Elvis disappeared behind the curtain. The cameras continued rolling for a few seconds. Carson sat down. Ed McMahon leaned toward him. "You know what just happened?" Carson looked at him. "What?" "You challenged Elvis Presley to a guitar battle." Carson laughed. "No." He looked toward the curtain. "I challenged a musician." Then he paused. "And I forgot how good he was." Backstage, Elvis placed the guitar in its case. A young stagehand approached him. "That was amazing." Elvis smiled. "Thank you." "Were you angry when you heard Carson's joke?" Elvis shook his head. "No." "Then why did you bring the guitar?" Elvis closed the case. He looked toward the studio one last time. "Because talking would have made it bigger." The stagehand waited. Elvis smiled. "Music made it smaller." "What do you mean?" Elvis picked up the guitar case. "When you answer with anger, people remember the argument." He began walking. "When you answer with music." He paused. "They remember the song." The stagehand smiled. Elvis continued down the hallway. But before he reached the exit, a producer came running toward him. "Elvis!" Elvis turned. "What?" The producer looked nervous. "There's something you need to know." "What happened?" The producer lowered his voice. "Your performance is already causing a problem." Elvis frowned. "What kind of problem?" The producer looked back toward the studio. "Someone upstairs wants to know why we let you go off script." Elvis smiled slightly. "Did the audience like it?" "Yes." "Did Carson like it?" "Yes." "Then what's the problem?" The producer hesitated. "The network doesn't like surprises." Elvis nodded. He looked down at the guitar case. Then he smiled. "Neither do I." He walked away. Behind him, the producer stood silently. And inside the studio, Johnny Carson was about to receive a phone call from the network. A phone call that would ask one uncomfortable question. Why did Elvis Presley just take over your show? And Carson already knew exactly what he was going to say. Because I gave him a reason. The studio lights were beginning to dim. The audience had gone home. The cameras were being covered. Stagehands were removing microphones and cables from the floor. But Johnny Carson was still sitting behind his desk. He wasn't smiling anymore. A few minutes earlier, Elvis Presley had walked off the stage with his guitar. The audience had loved every second of it. But now Carson was staring at the telephone on his desk. It rang. Once, twice. Carson picked it up. "Hello." A serious voice answered. "Johnny, we need to talk." Carson immediately knew who it was. The network. Yes. Carson sighed. I suppose this is about Elvis. There was a pause. You went completely off the planned segment. Carson leaned back. He did. You allowed him to. Carson smiled. He walked onto my stage with a guitar. That isn't the point. Then what is? The voice became colder. You embarrassed the show. Carson looked toward the empty stage. Actually, he smiled. I think I saved it. Silence. Then, Johnny, this isn't a joke. I know. You can't let guests take control of the broadcast. Carson looked at the guitar-shaped shadow that remained on the stage floor. Maybe. He paused. But sometimes the best television happens when nobody knows what's coming. The line went silent. Then the executive said, We'll discuss this tomorrow. The call ended. Carson placed the receiver down. He stared at it for several seconds. Then Ed McMahon walked over. What did they say? Carson smiled. They're angry. Ed laughed. About Elvis. Carson nodded. Ed looked toward the empty stage. Was it worth it? Carson thought about the audience. The silence. The guitar. Elvis's voice. Then he nodded. Yeah. Quick audience poll. What do you think? Should a live television host stick to the script no matter what? A. Yes. B. No. C. It depends on the moment. Write your answer below. And tell us where you're watching from. If you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Because the next morning, Carson was about to discover that the network wasn't the only one upset about what happened. The next morning, Carson arrived at the studio earlier than usual. He walked into his office carrying a cup of coffee. There were already 3 people waiting. A producer, a network executive, and a newspaper editor. Carson stopped at the doorway. What is this? The producer placed several newspapers on the desk. Carson looked at the headlines. His eyes widened. Elvis turns late-night joke into live musical moment. Another headline read, Carson apologizes to Elvis. Carson picked up the paper. He laughed. I apologized for a joke. The producer nodded. And everybody noticed. Carson put the newspaper down. That's television. The network executive didn't smile. This is exactly the problem. Carson looked at him. What problem? You've turned a comedy segment into a national story. Carson shrugged. People watched. They watched because Elvis surprised everyone. That's usually why people watch television. The executive shook his head. This can't happen again. Carson stared at him. Then he asked, what if the audience wants it to happen again? Nobody answered. Carson smiled. That might be the problem. Across town, Elvis was sitting quietly in a room. The guitar was nearby. Someone handed him a newspaper. He looked at the headline. Then another. Then another. He smiled. I didn't think it would become this big. A member of his team laughed. You played guitar on Carson's show. Of course it became big. Elvis shook his head. I wasn't trying to make a story. What were you trying to do? Elvis looked toward the guitar. Answer a joke. He paused. That's all. Then the telephone rang. Someone answered it. A moment later, they handed the receiver to Elvis. It's Johnny Carson. Elvis looked surprised. He picked up the phone. Hello. Carson's voice came through. Morning. Elvis smiled. Morning, Johnny. You've caused me some trouble. Elvis laughed. Me? Yes, you. You're the one who made the joke. Carson laughed. Fair point. Then his voice became serious. They're upset about what happened. Elvis leaned back. Why? Because it wasn't planned. Elvis smiled. Neither was the joke. Carson laughed. That's exactly what I told them. For a few seconds, both men were silent. Then Carson asked, Can I ask you something? Sure. Were you really trying to prove me wrong? Elvis thought about it. No. Then what were you doing? Elvis looked at the guitar. I wanted people to remember something. What? That I didn't become Elvis because of the clothes. Carson was quiet. Elvis continued. I became Elvis because of the music. Carson smiled on the other end. I understand. Then Elvis said, You know, Johnny. Yes. You weren't completely wrong. Carson laughed. What do you mean? The guitar is old. Carson laughed loudly. Thank you. Elvis smiled. But old doesn't mean useless. Carson became quiet. That's true. And sometimes. Elvis continued. Old things surprise people. Carson smiled. I think that's what happened last night. Audience poll. Do you think old school music still has the power to surprise people today? Yes or no? Comment your answer and tell us what country you're watching from *. And if you enjoy these dramatic stories, hit like and subscribe ***. Later that afternoon, something unexpected happened. Carson's producer received a phone call. It was from Elvis's team. They wanted to know if Carson would consider inviting Elvis back. The producer looked stunned. Back? Yes. For another show? Yes. The producer hung up and immediately went to Carson. Johnny. Carson looked up. What? Elvis wants to come back. Carson smiled. He wants another interview. No. Carson frowned. What then? He wants to bring the guitar. Carson stared at him. Then he started laughing. No. The producer looked confused. No. Carson shook his head. If he brings that guitar again, I'm finished. The producer laughed. Are you serious? Carson smiled. Absolutely. Then he paused. Unless. The producer waited. Unless what? Carson looked toward the studio. Unless we do something different. What? Carson smiled. We let him choose the song. The producer's eyes widened. You're serious? Carson nodded. Very. But before the plan could move forward, something happened that neither Carson nor Elvis expected. A letter arrived at the studio. It wasn't from a network executive. It wasn't from a critic. It wasn't from a fan. It was from an old musician. A man who claimed he had known Elvis before the world knew his name. The letter contained only a few paragraphs. But one sentence made Carson stop reading. It said, You reminded Elvis where he came from. Now remind the audience who helped him get there. Carson read the sentence twice. Then he looked at the producer. Who is this man? The producer shook his head. We don't know. Carson looked at the letter again. Find out. That evening, Elvis received a copy of the letter. He read it quietly. Then he stopped. His expression changed. Someone nearby noticed. What is it? Elvis didn't answer. He read the sentence again. Then he folded the paper. Where did this come from? I don't know. Elvis stood. Find out. The room became quiet. Because Elvis recognized something in those words. Someone from the past was reaching toward him. Someone who knew the young man behind the legend. And suddenly, the guitar wasn't just about Johnny Carson anymore. It was about everything that had happened before the fame. Before the lights. Before the crowds. Before the world started calling him the king. Elvis walked toward the guitar case. He opened it. He looked at the instrument. Then quietly said, "Maybe it's time." Someone asked, "Time for what?" Elvis didn't answer. He closed the case. And somewhere across town, Johnny Carson was reading the same letter. 2 men. 2 studios. 1 guitar. And a secret from Elvis's past that was about to come back into the spotlight. The next evening, Johnny Carson was still thinking about the mysterious letter. He had read it several times. One sentence kept bothering him. You reminded Elvis where he came from, now remind the audience who helped him get there. Carson placed the letter on his desk. Who wrote this? His producer shook his head. We are still trying to find out. Carson looked toward the studio. Find him. Why? Because whoever wrote this knows something. Something about the letter felt personal. It wasn't written like a fan letter. It sounded like someone who had been there. Someone who knew Elvis before the fame. Meanwhile, Elvis was preparing for another performance. His guitar case sat beside him. He opened it. The guitar was inside. He ran his fingers across the strings. His mind went back years. Before the giant stages. Before the cameras. Before millions of people knew his name. He remembered being young and uncertain. He remembered playing music while wondering if anybody would ever listen. Then he remembered something else. A man. A musician who had once told him, "Don't worry about being famous, worry about being honest." That sentence had stayed with Elvis. And now the mysterious letter had brought the memory back. Quick audience poll. Do you think Elvis would have become the same superstar without the people who supported him when he was young? Yes or no? Tell us your answer in the comments, and don't forget to write where you're watching from asterisk. If you've been following this story, like the video and subscribe asterisk. Because the secret behind the guitar is finally about to be revealed. The following evening, Elvis returned to the studio. Carson was waiting. But this time, something was different. There was no joke prepared. No surprise punchline. No scripted argument. Carson simply walked toward Elvis. Good to see you. Elvis smiled. You too. Carson looked at the guitar case. You brought it. Elvis nodded. You invited it. Carson laughed. Fair enough. They walked onto the stage together. The audience applauded. Carson sat behind his desk. Elvis sat nearby with the guitar. Carson held up the mysterious letter. I received this. Elvis immediately recognized it. His expression changed. You got one too. Carson nodded. Elvis looked toward the audience. Yes. Carson asked. Do you know who wrote it? Elvis shook his head. No. Carson leaned forward. But you know who they're talking about. Elvis was silent. Then he nodded. I think I do. Carson asked. Who? Elvis looked down at the guitar. Someone who believed in me before I believed in myself. The audience became quiet. Carson didn't interrupt. Elvis continued. When you're young, you don't know where you're going. He touched the guitar. You just know you want to go somewhere. He smiled. Sometimes one person gives you enough courage to take the next step. Carson asked, was this person a musician? Elvis nodded. Yes. Are they still alive? Elvis looked away. No. The audience became completely silent. Carson lowered the letter. I'm sorry. Elvis nodded. Thank you. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Elvis said, he told me something I'll never forget. Carson waited. He said, if people laugh, let them laugh, just don't let them stop you. Carson looked at the guitar. And that's why you picked it up backstage. Elvis nodded. Exactly. The audience applauded softly. Carson smiled. So I suppose my joke accidentally brought back a good memory. Elvis laughed. You could say that. Carson smiled. Then maybe I should make bad jokes more often. Elvis laughed. Don't push your luck. The audience laughed. The tension disappeared again. But Carson wasn't finished. He turned toward the camera. Ladies and gentlemen, sometimes we think we know the story behind a famous person. He looked at Elvis. But we only know the part that happened after the lights came on. Elvis nodded. Carson continued. Tonight, we are hearing about what happened before the lights. The audience applauded. Then Carson looked at Elvis. Would you play something for that person? Elvis didn't answer immediately. He looked at the guitar. Then he nodded. Yes. He lifted the instrument. The studio became quiet. Elvis began playing. This time there was something different in his performance. It wasn't about proving Carson wrong. It wasn't about defending his reputation. It was a tribute. A quiet thank you to someone who had believed in a young Elvis before the world knew his name. The audience listened. Carson didn't speak. The cameras stayed on Elvis. When the final note faded, nobody moved. Then the audience stood. The applause grew louder. Elvis lowered his head. For a moment, he looked emotional. Carson stood too. He walked toward Elvis. And without making a joke, he simply shook his hand. Then Carson said, I think I finally understand. Elvis smiled. Understand what? Why you were offended by the joke. Elvis shook his head. I wasn't offended. Carson looked surprised. You weren't. No. Elvis smiled. I just didn't want people to forget. Forget what? Elvis looked toward the guitar. That before I became a legend. He paused. I was just a guy with a guitar. The audience erupted in applause. Final audience poll. Now I want to hear from you. What made this story powerful? A. Elvis's music. B. Carson's apology. C. The meaning behind the guitar. D. The message about never forgetting where you started. Write your answer below. And tell us where you're watching from ***. If you enjoyed this story, like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves Elvis Presley. The cameras began preparing for the final shot. Carson returned to his desk. Elvis stood beside him. Carson looked toward the camera. "You know, Elvis." Elvis turned. "Yes, I think I owe you one more apology." Elvis smiled. "For what?" "For assuming that guitar was just part of the image." Elvis looked at the instrument. "It was never just an image." Carson nodded. "I know that now." Elvis smiled. "That's all that matters." The band began playing the closing music. Elvis started walking toward the curtain. Carson called after him, "Elvis." He turned. Carson pointed at the guitar. "Take good care of that thing." Elvis smiled. "I will. Because apparently it's better at comedy than I am." The audience burst into laughter. Elvis shook his head. "Good night, Johnny." "Good night, Elvis." Elvis disappeared behind the curtain. The camera slowly pulled back. Carson looked into the lens. For once, he didn't have another joke. He simply said, "Sometimes the best answer isn't an argument." He paused. "Sometimes it's a song." The screen faded, and the story of that strange night came to an end. But somewhere backstage, Elvis opened his guitar case one final time. He looked at the instrument. He touched the strings, and quietly said, "Still got it." Then he closed the case, and walked away. Because Johnny Carson had made a joke. Elvis Presley had answered with music. And in the end, nobody had really lost. The joke disappeared. The laughter faded. But the music remained. And that's why, decades later, the image of Elvis standing backstage with a guitar still feels like a reminder of something bigger than fame. Never forget the person you were before the world told you who you had to become.